Hello. This is probably one of the better pieces of parliamentary oratory that I've heard in the last year by Stephen Kinnock. And it gets to the heart of the matter, and he persists despite quite a lot of interruptions. But I'll just give you this as a really good example of parliamentary business in the Commons at its best.
Mr. Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I rise today to speak in favour of all 10 of the Lord's amendments that are before us today. They each serve to make this shambolic mess of a bill marginally less absurd. And, as I will come to in a second, they would serve only to put in statute what ministers have actually promised from that dispatch box. Not one of these amendments is designed to prevent the departure of flights to Rwanda, as the Prime Minister has repeatedly and wrongly implied that they will. Mr. Speaker, we all want to end the Tory small boats chaos, and I am proud that the Labour Party has consistently put forward a smart, pragmatic and sensible plan to do so, starting by going after the criminal smuggler gangs at source through a new cross-border police unit and a new security partnership with Europol. But this bill and the treaty which accompanies it will not contribute in any way to achieving that aim. Because I will give way.
I'm very grateful for him giving way on that point. Since 2020, we've seen 82 gangs disrupted and over 400 people arrested because of the actions of this government. I'm keen to understand, with Labour's idea of smash the gangs, how many more they expect that to be, how much more that will cost, and what does that look like in a total percentage of numbers?
We will eradicate the activity of the criminal smuggler gangs by having a proper security partnership with our European partners and allies. I'd remind the honourable gentleman that his party has spent the last 8 years trashing and destroying our relationships with our European partners and allies. So what we would have with a Labour government is a basis of trust to get the results that we need to see for the British people. That is what sovereignty is all about, Mr. Speaker. Because the entire Rwanda debacle has absorbed a vast amount of time, energy and money that should instead have been focused on taking back control of our border security from the criminal gangs who are trading in human misery. And let's not forget that more than 100,000 asylum seekers have crossed in small boats since then, with 40,000 on this Prime Minister's watch alone. This chaos must end. And this government is clearly unable to restore order at the border. So it's clearly time for them to get out of the way so Labour can get the job done. Mr. Speaker, before I get into the substance of the amendments, I'd like to pay tribute to the noble members of the other place who tabled them. In so doing, they were fulfilling their constitutional, democratic and patriotic duty by scrutinising and seeking to amend this bill just as they would any other piece of legislation that comes before them. They have not been intimidated or sidetracked by the Prime Minister's mistaken assertion that this legislation should have some kind of special status or treatment, which should somehow allow ministers to railroad it through Parliament and drive and coach and horses through Britain's long-standing democratic conventions. Indeed, this profoundly dismissive attitude has manifested itself in the way in which the government has point-blank refused to engage with these Lord's amendments, rejecting every one of them, rather than seeking to use them and see them as a basis for negotiation and compromise. I will give way.
I'm most grateful to the honourable gentleman. Is he aware of the fact that the Constitutional Committee of the House of Lords, which does in fact include a significant number of the members of the House of Lords to which he's just referred, actually quite explicitly stated in relation, and I'm speaking here about Amendment 1, Clause 1, that where it is clear and unambiguous in the words used in a statute that international law gives way to the supremacy and sovereignty of the United Kingdom Parliament. They said it in paragraph 58 of their report only last year.
Well, what I would remind the honourable gentleman of is that the Supreme Court, the highest court of our land, has ruled unanimously and in no uncertain terms that Rwanda is not a safe country to which to send asylum seekers. And I recognise, I know he's very taken with parliamentary sovereignty, and that's very important. parliamentary sovereignty must be based on paying due regard to the findings of our judiciary, and it is to be exercised with caution and moderation, Mr. Speaker, and that is why it's so important that our colleagues in the other place have played this role. I will give way one more time.
I am extremely grateful, because this is right at the heart of this matter. In the Rwanda judgment itself, in paragraph 144, it is unequivocal that the Lord President of the Supreme Court ruled the dismissal of one of the cases, ASM, an Iraqi, on very specific grounds, and he said that because of the sovereignty of Parliament with respect to the legislation under the Immigrations Act and the Retained EU Law Act, the consequence was that they had to dismiss his claim precisely because in that judgment the supremacy of Parliament prevailed for the very reason I've just given, and that is at paragraph 144 under the principle of legality.
Well, I thank him for his intervention, but at the end of the day, you cannot legislate to turn dogs into cats. You cannot legislate for the sky to be green and the grass to be blue. And it is a basic tenet of the respect with which our institutions should be treated that to put this kind of absurd legislation before us is frankly turning our institutions into a laughingstock. So I would respectfully suggest that the honourable gentleman keeps that in mind. Now, let's be clear, Mr. Speaker, the only special or unique status in terms of the aspects of this bill and the treaty that accompany it that can be found are in its extortionate implementation costs, its unlawful nature and its glaring unworkability. Indeed, as I move into the details of these amendments, I feel it's important to point out that since the Rwanda bill was last debated in this place, even more evidence of the astonishing unaffordability of the scheme has come to light. This failing scheme was already costing the British taxpayer almost £400 million, even though not a single asylum seeker has been sent to Rwanda. But every new detail is more astounding than the last. And we recently learned that the first 300 asylum seekers to be sent to Rwanda would cost the British taxpayer an extra £200 million on top of that, earning an invoice worth £570 million from the Rwandan government for just 1% of the 30,000 asylum seekers who crossed the small boats last year. That's almost £2 million per asylum seeker. Just let that sink in for a moment. £2 million to send just one asylum seeker from the UK to Rwanda. And then another 182,000 per person on top of that. In comparison, to process an asylum seeker in the UK, in comparison, it costs just £21,000.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. He will be aware of the thousands of asylum seekers that are being dispersed up and down the country with very little support to local services. So while the government is obsessing with gimmicks that are not dealing with the real problems in communities and supporting local communities to host that they are dispersing up and down the country, this crisis continues and they need to get a grip on it.
I thank my honourable friend. She's absolutely right that the smoke and mirrors that's been used about clearing the backlog, lots of administrative withdrawals, lots of other ways of just getting people out of the backlog, is being combined with shortening the eviction period, which is leading to a staggering increase in homelessness amongst those who've been granted asylum. It is frankly a stain on the conscience of our country, what's happening with that, a total lack of coordination between the Home Office, DLUC and our colleagues in local authorities, and it is leaving our local authorities high and dry. I will give way.
I thank him for giving way. Whilst I might not share many of the views which he's expressing in this bill, does he not share my surprise that the government has refused to accept Amendment 8, which would have required it to report on the success of this bill, where the number of removals would be reported to Parliament, yet the government doesn't want that? Does he suspect that, like I, that maybe the government knows that this bill is not going to be as effective as what they think it's going to be?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman. That's an excellent question, and who knows, perhaps sometimes the mask slips in terms of the government's response to some of these amendments. The reason they've decided to very disrespectfully refuse to engage on any of them is perhaps because, exactly as he says, they are very worried about what might happen if they do. When you lift the lid on the box, you see that it's a total failure inside it.
On that point, I do thank the Shadow Minister because he is making an excellent speech. But let us not forget history. The Tories' Rwanda bill is the third new law on channel crossings in just 3 years. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the first law has only been partly suspended because it had so many problems and it was actually making things worse. The second bill has still not been fully enacted. And this is a third bill, another gimmick at £2 million per person cost to the public purse. And does my honourable friend agree that rather than constantly chasing gimmicks and trying to dupe the British public, that the government finally needs to get a grip on the situation and stop pursuing these gimmicks?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and I agree with every word of what he said. Just imagine if the amount of time and money and resource and energy and political capital that has been burned on this harebrained Rwanda scheme had been used on doing things that might actually deliver. And just imagine if they'd listened to Labour's plan for delivering the change that we need to see. We might have actually got some progress and seen things working. And by the way, we've supported what the government's done on Albania. Why don't we see more of that rather than this utterly ridiculous government by gimmick? What a waste of time and money. Now, the level of waste and this government's cavalier attitude to taxpayers' money are utterly staggering. And where, oh where, is the plan for the other 99% that they say are going to be inadmissible? Tens of thousands of people who are now ineligible to be processed, ineligible to claim in our asylum system, but they can't be sent to Rwanda either. That particular backlog, the so-called PERMA backlog, currently stands at 56,000 people, with most of them living in more than 300 taxpayer-funded hotels across the country, costing millions of pounds every single day. Which is why
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way. You make a very powerful argument about the wasteful nature of this government's policy. Is my friend aware that the £2 million cost per person of sending someone to Rwanda would cover 67 new police officers in my constituency or 72 new nurses to fix the horrendous backlog created by this shambolic government?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for giving way. He's absolutely done his maths on the £2 million. I did particularly enjoy the analogy with the Virgin Galactic space and craft, and that really does show that the Rwanda plan is a galactically wasteful policy. But he's quite right on the fact that so much of this is about choices and priorities, and the choices and priorities that the government has shown are simply the wrong ones in terms of wasting very valuable taxpayers' money that could be so better focused elsewhere. And that is why we support Lord's Amendment 8, Mr. Speaker, which is a Labour frontbench amendment in the name of the noble Lord Coker. This amendment requires the government to report on the timetable for removing inadmissible asylum seekers under the Illegal Migration Act. We absolutely need to see accountability over the inadmissibility provisions that have created that PERMA backlog of 55,000 small boat asylum seekers stuck in limbo, unable to be processed. So perhaps the Minister could tell us now, if 99% of the people crossing in small boats are not likely to be sent to Rwanda, then what will happen to them? Will the Minister just now admit that in spite of all his bluff and bluster, they will simply be let into our asylum system after all? I don't know if he wants to. No. The whole premise of inadmissibility was always a one-way street to limbo and shambles, as the Shadow Home Secretary and I have warned the ministers in this chamber continuously over the past 2 years. There is, of course, an alternative. I hope members opposite have been listening, because for the last 18 months at this dispatch box, myself and my right honourable friend, the Shadow Home Secretary, have been absolutely clear on how Labour will prevent the dangerous and life-threatening channel crossings, and how we will also fix our broken asylum system. I've already mentioned how we would redirect the money set aside for the Rwandan government into a cross-border police unit and intelligence-sharing security partnership with Europol in order to smash the criminal smuggler gangs upstream. But as part of our plan, we would also ensure people who have no right to be here are removed to a safe third country. Since 2010, under the Tories, removals have collapsed. The returns of foreign national offenders have fallen by 27%, and the returns of failed asylum seekers have fallen by 44%. Under Labour's plan, a new returns and enforcement unit would include 1,000 additional officials to expedite removals, with £35 million set aside to create new Nightingale courts to fast-track appeals and to pursue tougher action on employers who employ migrants illegally.
I thank the Shadow Minister for giving way. He says he wants removals to a safe third country. Which one?
I thank the sorry, I'm very sorry. Would the honourable member just mind repeating that? I was just.
Oh, thank you. Well, it's always good to listen to an intervention, but I'll repeat it for him. He said one of these parts of his plan would be to remove people to a safe third country. Simple question. If not Rwanda, which one? I
apologise. It should have said home country. I should have said home country. I misspoke, and I'd like to correct the record. I'm sorry. It was home country. Apologies. I misspoke there. Labour's common-sense, pragmatic plan will smash the business model of the criminal gangs, deter dangerous journeys and tackle the backlog. Mr Speaker, I will in 1 second. With your permission, I will now run through the remaining 9 amendments that have come to us from the other place. We support each of them for the reasons that I will now set out.
I'm grateful for giving way. How much would Labour's plan cost?
As I've already said, I don't know if the honourable member was listening, this is about repurposing the vast quantities of taxpayers' money that are being squandered on his harebrained Rwanda plan, and that rechanneling of that money will fund the clearance of the backlog, the sorting out returns and smashing the criminal gangs. Now, I would first like to focus on Lord's Amendment 10, tabled by the noble Lord Brown. This amendment seeks to exempt individuals who have worked in support of the UK government or armed forces from removal to Rwanda under the provisions of this bill. This amendment is driven by a moral imperative, Mr Deputy Speaker. We owe a debt of gratitude to those who have supported our defence, diplomacy and development abroad, not least in Afghanistan, and it beggars belief that the government would even consider sending this cohort of heroes who are fleeing the Taliban to Rwanda. Britain's commitment towards these loyal to Britain Afghans is, of course, felt most strongly by our own armed forces. But this government has continually shirked its responsibilities towards Afghans, including by leaving thousands of those with a right to be in the UK stranded in Pakistan for more than a year. Little wonder that they have resorted to making these desperate journeys across the Channel. Operation Warm Welcome has become Operation Cold Shoulder, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Talking about he wants more Afghanistani people to come from Pakistan to the UK. How many more immigrants does he want to come to the UK from Afghanistan?
Well, the amendment is about stopping them being sent to Rwanda, but let's be absolutely clear. There are many, many Afghans who have been identified by the government under the ARAP and ACRS schemes. Those are the people that are languishing in Pakistan because this government we of course remember the Prime Minister's memo to Whitehall saying, by the way, everybody, let's slow pedal on these Afghans who are in Pakistan who have been identified for resettlement under the ACRS and ARAP. So if he wants to know the number, I recommend that he goes to his own government and asks how many have been identified under ARAP and ACRS. I will give way.
I'm grateful to him for giving way. In my own constituency, I met one family who were in a similar situation where the constituent's husband had been killed in Afghanistan and still in this limbo land because of the delay in decision-making. And also, is he aware that there is now a situation where Pakistan is forcing Afghan asylum seekers back to Afghanistan, and there are tens of thousands of people in that situation, some of whom will be those who worked to support our forces during the war in Afghanistan.
Well, and that, of course, my honourable friend is absolutely right, because that is the scope of this amendment tabled in the name of Lord Brown is specifically for those who served shoulder to shoulder with our armed forces and our diplomatic and development efforts in Afghanistan. So these are people to whom the United Kingdom owes a debt of honour and a debt of gratitude. I'm not sure honour is a word that we can apply very easily to the benches opposite, but that is what it's about. Lord's Amendment number 9 in the name... I will just... in one, if I will... yes, thank you. Lord's Amendment number 9 in the name of the noble Baroness Butler-Sloss is also based on a moral imperative, Mr Deputy Speaker, as it would prevent the removal of potential victims of modern slavery to Rwanda until they receive a decision from the government on whether there is credible evidence that the person is a modern slavery victim. It really should go without saying that modern slavery victims should not be being sent to Rwanda. But sadly, with this government, basic moral decency is a scarce commodity.
On both 9 and 10, can I just say those of us who've dealt with both traffic victims and also those of us who've dealt with those who served us in Afghanistan, this indicates some loss of moral compass here somewhere. And with regard to those who served us in Afghanistan in a whole range of different functions, they have survived just to get out of the country, having been chased by the Afghani Taliban. Their families have been harassed. Some of them have got to Pakistan and then been threatened with force back over the border again. They've got to us traumatised, and we're going to traumatise them again by sending them to Rwanda. This cannot be right, and I can't believe honourable members who've dealt with any of these cases could not support these amendments, because it's human suffering in the extreme, but particularly those who've served us, human suffering brought about by their loyalty to us.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and he makes the case with passion and conviction. I know that he also has a number of asylum seekers and refugees in his constituency, and he does a huge amount of work on their behalf. I think he's absolutely right that there are some issues which should really transcend the day-to-day political considerations that we have in this place, because they are issues that are based on moral imperatives. And it is deeply disappointing that in both of these amendments that he mentions, the government has refused to even have the basis for a negotiation or some kind of compromise to allow. And we do find that deeply disappointing. I will give them.
Would you agree with me in answer to the earlier question that was posed to him, how many? That the simple answer is all those who served, who risked their lives to help us in a war which required the support of the local population. Those people, if they're in danger, and if we've got records of the help that they gave and the support which they gave, surely we can't turn our back on those individuals.
I thank the honourable gentleman, and what a contrast between his intervention and the intervention of the gentleman on the other benches. I genuinely believe that when the gentleman on the opposite benches reflects, he will regret the intervention that he made, and perhaps he could reflect on what the honourable gentleman on the bench behind said. We on these benches are also profoundly concerned about unaccompanied children being inadvertently sent to Rwanda. For this reason, we support Lord's Amendment 7 in the name of the noble Baroness Lister, which reverses changes to age assessment procedures established by the Illegal Migration Act in relation specifically to removals to Rwanda. It restores the ability of domestic courts and tribunals to fully consider suspensive judicial review claims regarding removal decisions taken on the basis of age assessment of unaccompanied children. Lord's Amendments 1 to 6 all relate to the rule of law. We support all of these amendments, and they are all principles that government ministers have said that they agree with. Indeed, the simple question that should be asked in relation to each one of these amendments is this: if ministers believe that Rwanda is a safe country, then why is the government refusing to support these amendments? They say that this bill abides by international law, so why not just make that clear on the face of the bill? They say that Rwanda is a safe country and is meeting its obligations, so let's see the evidence and agree but a trust but verify mechanism. In this spirit, Lord's Amendment 1 is a Labour frontbench amendment which places a responsibility on the government to comply in full with its current obligations under domestic and international law. Lord's Amendment 2 and...
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way, but does he not accept that Amendment 1 is entirely OTOs? In terms of compliance with domestic law, this bill, when enacted, will be an element of domestic law. And in terms of compliance with international law, isn't it the case that it's predicated on international law, that is to say, the Rwanda Treaty?
Well, if that's the case, then why aren't government ministers accepting the amendment? I mean, it is simply those with a great deal more constitutional expertise than I in the other place seeking reassurances that our democratic conventions, that our obligations in terms of alignment with the rule of law, will be respected. And as the honourable gentleman has pointed out, if that's the case, then surely these amendments should be perfectly acceptable to the government.
I thank the member for giving way. Perhaps I can help shed light on this, because the government minister has just shown that the government is not abiding by its international obligations. The Good Friday Agreement explicitly commits us to working together, those words are in it, with the Irish government when it comes to the rights of individuals in Northern Ireland. This piece of legislation will deny rights to individuals in Northern Ireland, and yet the government minister has admitted they have not even consulted the Irish government. So does my honourable member agree with me? Our word is our bond as a country, and if we show we can't be trusted to stand up for international law, it's absolutely right that this place demands the government puts it on the face of a bill.
Well, I agree with my honourable friend. She makes a very clear case. I would also say, of course, there's a lot of rhetoric that has accompanied this bill around the ECHR and the United Kingdom's obligations in international law, and the implications of that for the Good Friday Agreement are truly chilling. The way in which the benches opposite are prepared to sabre rattle and use rhetoric in a way that undermines our reliability as a partner that can be trusted to respect our international legal obligations is frankly shameful and deeply concerning, and not least in the case of the Good Friday Agreement. Lord's Amendments 2 and 3, in the name of the noble Lord Hope, state that Rwanda may only be considered to be a safe country if and when the measures set out in the Rwanda Treaty have been fully implemented, and the Monitoring Committee has established that this is the case. The government claims that the measures in the treaty address concerns in the Supreme Court's recent ruling, so there is absolutely no reason why ministers should refuse to accept Lord Hope's amendments. Lord's Amendments 4 and 5, in the name of the noble Lord Anderson, state that Rwanda can be considered a safe country unless there is credible evidence to the contrary, as determined by a court or tribunal. Following the Supreme Court's ruling, the government itself accepted that the situation in Rwanda is not static, but evolving, as it is in every other country on the face of the earth, Mr. Deputy Speaker. So if the government accepts that Rwanda could one day become safer for asylum seekers that are sent there from the UK, it must by definition also accept that it could one day deteriorate. Lord Anderson's amendments simply provide a basis for assessing the situation on the ground in Rwanda and acting accordingly. Finally,
friend for giving way. A joint statement signed by over 260 civil society organisations has branded this bill, quote, a constitutionally extraordinary and deeply harmful piece of legislation that threatens the universality of human rights and is likely in breach of international law, striking a serious blow to the UK's commitment to the rule of law. Would my friend agree that this bill represents an unethical gimmick that will potentially put vulnerable people, very vulnerable people, at risk and harm the UK's reputation on the world stage?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and she's absolutely right. And just think if, as I was saying, if the amount of time and energy that's been wasted on this madcap bill, which is also a constitutional outrage, unaffordable, unlawful and unworkable, had been actually put into addressing some of the challenges that we face in a pragmatic way, just think where we could have got to by today. So, finally, the Lord's Amendment 6, in the name of the noble Baroness Chakrabarti, allows government ministers, officials and courts to consider whether Rwanda is safe on a case-by-case basis. Given that the government has accepted that some appeals will be allowed, we see no reason for the government to reject this amendment. Mr. Deputy Speaker, after 14 years of incompetent and negligent governance, our asylum system is in a mess. The Conservatives have presided over a backlog of 130,000 asylum seekers, despite ministers attempting to pull the wool over the public's eyes through administrative withdrawals and various other ruses. There are still 46,000 asylum seekers in taxpayer-funded hotels, contributing to an asylum system which now costs 10 times what it did under Labour at an eye-watering £5.4 billion. And only last week we discovered there were major problems with a broken immigration IT system, which has mixed up details of applicants affecting a staggering 76,000 people. But this con of a bill is not the way to fix the problems that this Conservative government has created. The highest court in our land has ruled unanimously that Rwanda is not a safe country, and no amount of ludicrous legislation like this bill can change that fact. The government may well wish to say that the sky is green and the grass is blue, but introducing an Act of Parliament will never make it so. And even the benches opposite recognise this bill is on a hiding to nothing, Mr Deputy Speaker. Indeed, a former Home Secretary has stated that it is highly unlikely to work, and the former Immigration Minister has described the government's aim as being to get a few, and I quote, symbolic half-filled flights taking off this spring, rather than having a plan that is a genuine attempt to tackle the dangerous channel crossings. So it is probably also no surprise that ministers are finally now turning to Plan B, paying people a reported £3,000 per head to go to Rwanda instead. Can this really be true? And if so, would the Minister like to take the opportunity to enlighten the House today on some of the details? Would this £3,000 per head come on top of the £570 million cost we already know about? Will there be another treaty between the UK and Rwanda to implement this? And if so, will he publish it? Have the NAO done an assessment of these additional costs? And will the House be able to vote on this new plan that has been briefed? I await the Minister's responses with interest. Mr Deputy Speaker, this bill is a con. The treaty is a con. The whole Rwanda plan is a con. It is quite simply a headline-chasing gimmick, as unworkable as it is unaffordable. The country knows it. This House knows it. The Home Secretary knows it. And the Minister knows it. At £2 million per head, the Rwanda scheme is the worst value for money policy in history. But the amendments that I have spoken to today will not stop flights